So I just want to say welcome, everybody. Welcome to this 5th instalment of the HearMus Seminar. Today we've got two speakers, Waldo, Nogueira, and also Scott Bannister. And I'm going to hand over to Kai to introduce Waldo. Please do make sure that you've done a bit of housekeeping. Please do make sure that you've got your microphones off if you're joining us, and yeah, we'll have opportunities for Q&A after each talk, and then potentially at the end as well. So yeah, okay, thank you.
Yeah, hello everyone. Today we have the pleasure to have Waldo Nogueira with us, live from the RAO conference in Florida today. Let's hope that the internet connection remains stable. For those who don't know Waldo, he has sort of an international CV with alternating currents between Hannover and Barcelona. So he studied in Barcelona, then got his PhD from Leipzig University in Hannover on DSP for cochlear implants. Worked as a research engineer for advanced bionics in Hannover, then again did a postdoc in Barcelona at Pompeu Fabra University in music technology. And I think that's also where his work on music for CI started. Since 2013, he's now head of the auditory prosthetic group at Hannover Medical School. And since 2020, he's full professor there. Also working as a PI in the Cluster of Excellence Hearing for All, and very active in the field of music CI. Since 2022, he runs an ERC consolidator grant on electric acoustic interactions and cochlear implant processing. So he's really one of the experts in the field. And could it be that we lost Waldo now that he's supposed to present? I don't see him anymore.
Can you hear me?
You're still there. Okay, great,
I'm
wonderful.
there.
Do you want to share your slides again? I don't see the slides anymore.
Okay. I thought I was already sharing. Yeah, so the connection is not optimal. Please let me know if you. Okay.
Waldo.
All right. Can you hear me?
We can
We
now.
can hear you. I can't see
right.
you, and I can see your slides.
So I try to share my screen again. Let me know if you see my screen. No. So I will try to get closer to the router. Maybe can you?
I think now screen sharing started.
Now screen sharing starts. So, all right.
Cool. So let me say my last sentence, Waldo. So, Waldo, we're very happy to have you in the seminar. It's a really valuable contribution. And we're looking forward to your talk on signal processing sound coding strategies for music. Let's hope that things will work.
Very much. Yeah, I hope so. I cross fingers. So thank you very much for the kind introduction. I apologize in advance for maybe unstable internet connection. So I'm in an apartment and I was hoping to have a better connection, but it's what we have. So let me know anytime if something is not running well. And today I will focus on signal processing and sound coding strategies. I would say to try to make music more accessible for cochlear implant users. And in the beginning of the talk, I will focus more on singing music, but more at the end, I will touch a little bit also how to make instrumental music more accessible for cochlear implant users. And I will not talk in a generic way. I will talk about our specific studies. So as an introduction, we wanted to make singing music more accessible for cochlear implant users, because music, well, as we know, is an effective way to communicate to the masses. And the singing voice especially is very important for this communication. Also, most of the pop songs that people listen to are or contain lyrics with accompaniment. And of course, voice is very important to transmit the meaning through the lyrics, the emotion, and also the melody. But we know, and that has been presented in previous seminars, that cochlear implant users have strong difficulties to perceive music in general, but also the singing voice. And when I refer to the singing voice, I refer to the melody of the singing voice, but also the understanding of the lyrics. Okay, so yeah, I will focus on singing music because it's very important for pop music. It transmits emotions. It transmits the main melody and the lyrics. But as we know, cochlear implant users have extreme difficulties to perceive the singing music. So we need strategies to make it more accessible for cochlear implant users. And we have worked in different domains to make music more accessible. And here we see a block diagram with these different strategies that we have been working on. On the one hand, we have tried to create music compositions that are more easy to perceive by cochlear implant users. On the other hand, we have also worked with signal pre-processing algorithms. I will introduce later some AI algorithms. We have also worked with sound coding strategies. In this case, the sound coding strategy converts the audio signals into the electric signals. And there are also the possibilities that I will not cover today, like, for example, changing the shape of the pulses and the modality on how these pulses are stimulated to convey the information back in terms of information to the of the cochlear implant. But today I will focus on music compositions, signal pre-processing, and sound coding. All right, and we have a review paper that we published a few years ago together with the group of Rainer Martin in the University in Bochum, where we reviewed some of these strategies. All right, so regarding new music compositions for cochlear implants, we worked in different projects or different concerts where we explored methodologies to compose music for cochlear implant users. And this was a project where we worked together with musicians, composers, cochlear implant users, but also researchers to create this music. This music was very experimental, so it was mainly focusing on electroacoustic music, trying to, have a music that is not restricting, let's say, the perception, typical biases that we have in, for example, Western music. So we created 3 concerts, and the data here corresponds to the last concert, where 206 people attended. From them, there were 50 cochlear implant users and 150 normal hearing listeners. And the idea of this concert was to present the music, and after each music piece, the audience had to fill a questionnaire where they had to respond to different aspects about the music perception that they obtained. There were some technical aspects, there were some emotional aspects, and some appreciation aspects. And in this way, we could compare how different was the perception of the music by the cochlear implant users and the normal hearing listeners. So in order to make the music more accessible in this concert, what we did was to do some enhancement of the lyrics. And what we did, for example, was real-time visualization of the fundamental frequency. So, for example, we were displaying on the screen, you can see it on the top, some visualizations on the screen of how the melody, the main melody, the pitch, was being modified during the music piece. On the other hand, when we had a clear singing voice in the front, then we were also recording the lips to provide some visual cues to understand the lyrics together with transcription of the text. And in cases where the music was not so prominent, then what we did was to project the lyrics on a black or on screen on the backstage. So in this way, we could compare the perception of the music by the normal hearing and the cochlear implant group. And what we saw is that the music appreciation and the emotion that was elicited by these music pieces between the cochlear implants and the normal hearing groups was not statistically significantly different. However, we saw that cochlear implant users preferred music with clear melodies and with singing. So from the different pieces, we had some that were more clear in terms of the singing voice, and some others that were less clear from a singing voice perspective. So cochlear implant users showed preference for singing voice with clear melodies and singing. And even if we saw this the result, cochlear implant users rated their speech understanding of the singing voice worse than normal hearing listeners. So some of this music was in English or in German, but still they complained about the understanding of the lyrics. So for us, the results of this concert indicated that we need some technology, for example, pre-processing, so signal processing techniques that enhance the singing voice to make the music appreciation better for cochlear implant subjects. And this is what motivated us to work on signal pre-processing algorithms. And now I will give you a brief overview of the work that we have been doing in that area. So this work of signal pre-processing for cochlear implants is inspired by the, I would say, pioneering work of Bujens in 2014. He showed that cochlear implant users have different mixing preferences than normal hearing listeners when listening to pop Western music. Actually, he showed that indeed cochlear implant users prefer an enhancement of the singing voice with respect to the background instruments. So we reproduced this result. That was the work of Pons 2016. So we reproduced these results in our lab, and indeed we could confirm that CA users prefer the vocals, so the singing voice, to be enhanced with respect to the beat and the accompaniment elements of the music. So at that time, it was the beginning of, I would say, of audio and AI statistical signal processing. So there were some algorithms already out there, and we thought that we could use these technologies from music technology into the cochlear implant field. So we thought the state-of-the-art signal processing technologies could potentially be used as a preprocessor to remix available mono or stereo mixes. And here is the idea. So the input to the sound processor, which is a microphone or two microphones, that doesn't matter too much, is a mono or stereo mix. So typically one microphone, so it will be a mono. And there we have all the elements of pop Western music contained. Yeah, so the singing voice, the drums, keyboard, guitar, and bass. And the idea is to use AI, so to use statistical signal processing to separate the different sources into the different tracks. So we would train a neural network to separate the vocals, the drums, and the accompaniment. And afterwards, the idea is to apply a gain to each of these estimated multi-tracks and then remix, so downmix the different components. And once we have downmixed these components, then we would send it to the speech processor of the cochlear implant. So that's why we call this as a pre-processing algorithm, because we pre-process the sounds before sending them to the sound processor of the cochlear implant. And we wanted to have different AI algorithms with different complexities. And I mean computational complexity. So in the end, cochlear implants need to run in real time and with low latency. So it's important to have algorithms that also work efficiently in terms of computation. And for this reason, we had as a reference the original multitracks. So we have the multitracks of our music, so we could remix them with full quality. But then we use different algorithms like non-negative matrix factorization. We used also multi-layer perceptron, so a very simple neural network, and a deep recurrent neural network, so relatively simple networks, to do this source separation. And finally, we had a much more complex algorithm, which was called deep convolutional autoencoder neural network, with much more complexity, because we thought that these simple algorithms would not reach enough quality to remix the music. So we wanted to have a wide spectrum of algorithms, from simple ones that could run in real time in a cochlear implant speech processor to complex ones. So we will see that the multi-layer perceptron and the deep recurrent neural network, which can be implemented in real time, also elicit good quality for source separation and remixing for cochlear implants. So here's the idea of these algorithms. The idea is that we have our sound, our music, and this music is then transformed into the frequency domain. So we use a short time Fourier transform, and then we get at the output the magnitude of the spectrum and the phase of the spectrum. So the phase is preserved. We use the original phase. And what we do is we separate in the spectrum two sources, I sub 1 and I sub 2. And the two sources will be the singing voice and the accompaniment of the music. So once we have separated the two sources, then we will apply an inverse short-time Fourier transform, and we will get in the time domain the singing voice and the background instruments, the accompaniment, and then we will have a remixing of the music. And this remixing is controlled by the vocals to instruments ratio, which is the parameter that defines how much gain do we apply to the vocals with respect to the background instruments. And once the music has been remixed, then we send it to the cochlear implant. So I would like to give you a bit of intuition about what the source separation algorithm is doing at the level of the magnitude of the spectrum. And this is what we see on the right side at the top. So there we see these matrices, these pictures, 2D pictures, where we see the spectrogram of the signal. And this has a kind of encoder-decoder architecture. So from the spectrum, we reduce the dimensionality. So we see that in each step of the source separation algorithm, the dimensionality is reduced. So we go to a small dimensionality, the latent space. And from this low dimensionality, then we separate because there we have the most important features of the spectrum. And it's in this latent space where we can do the separation between the singing voice and the background instruments. So I will play you an example of the separated vocals. So let's see if I can share my sound. That will be a bit dangerous, but let's try. So I play the vocals. Come back to me, come back to me. So could you confirm that you could hear the sound?
Yes, we could hear the sound.
Great. So these were the vocals, but you could perceive also the background instruments. So there is some distortion because the algorithm doesn't work perfectly. And now let's listen to the background instruments. You can hear, you can still perceive a little bit the vocals. It's removed, but you can still perceive it. So these source separation algorithms for high quality source separation, so in the music technology field, maybe at least at that time were not suitable, but we thought maybe for cochlear implants, we can use them because we will remix the vocals and the instruments again, and then these artifacts are not perceived. So what we see at the bottom is the spectrogram of this music piece that I just played, and the vocals to instruments ratio is 0 dB. So that means that we didn't modify the level of the vocals with respect to the background instruments. So I will play this original sound. Come back to me, come back to me. Right now, we will use the source separated sources from the algorithm, and we will remix to 6 dB. So we will increase the level of the voice by 6 dB. And now you can hear it. Come back to me, come back to me. All right. So we evaluated this source separation algorithm in terms of quality. So what's the quality and of the music remixed with source separation with respect to the original multi-tracks? And for this, we used a Mushra procedure where we had a reference. The reference was the original multi-track. And you can see that the reference obtained the highest scores in Mushra, more than 80% for both groups, a group of 13 cochlear implant users and 12 normal hearing listeners. We had also an anchor. The anchor is a low quality remix, which is low pass filtered and includes some distortions. And you can see that it was rated much lower. For normal hearing subjects, it was rated as 0 because they could detect it very easily. For some cochlear implant users, we see that they had still difficulties to detect this clear anchor. But what we can see is that for any of the algorithms, from the complex ones, two versions of this deep convolutional autoencoder, the deep recurrent neural network, and the multi-layer perceptron, and the non-negative matrix factorization, more or less they achieved the same quality in terms of quality with respect to the reference. Yes, so that means that we can use these simple neural networks to remix the music for cochlear implant users. And these simple algorithms can indeed be implemented in current signal processing algorithms, so current sound processors for cochlear implants. So that's why we focused on these simple algorithms. But still, we can go into real-time implementations. But the question is whether do we really need these algorithms in real environments, in real music environments? And for this reason, we decided to explore if it's necessary to increase the vocals to instruments ratio in different sound scenarios. So what we did is we simulated different sound scenarios, one simulating a large hall. So like you go to a concert and you're in a large hall with reverberation, or for example, another scenario with a small hall with low reverberation. And then the question here was whether cochlear implant users, independent of the acoustics, they still want to have the vocals to instruments ratio increased. And on the other hand, we wanted to investigate if visual information also affects the need to increase the vocals to instruments ratio. And for this, what we did is we used the recordings of the concert that I presented you before. So we had recordings during the concert using an eigen mic to then reproduce the sound that we had in the concert. And we also record with a 360 camera, the videos, such that the cochlear implant listeners could have a realistic experience of the concert that we organized. And then we asked them to modify the vocals to instruments ratio to assess if visual information is needed. So here we see the results for the first experiment in normal hearing subjects on the left and in cochlear implant users on the right, and for the two different sound scenarios. And what we see is that normal hearing listeners did not require any increase or decrease of the vocals to instruments ratio. It was just fine as it was. But cochlear implant users, again, showed a preference for increased vocals with respect to the background instruments and in both sound scenarios. So that means that increasing the vocals to instruments ratio in singing music is preferred irrespective of the sound scenario. And when we go to the second experiment, where we analyzed the effect of having or not having visual information, again, we see in cochlear implant users, in both situations, with and without visual information, preferred an increased vocals to instruments ratio. So with this, I think we have a technology that could be very useful for cochlear implant users. Just separating the singing voice from the background instruments and enhancing the voice would improve their music appreciation. But still, we need chips in the sound processor that implement these neural networks. This is something that it's becoming possible nowadays, but a few years ago, when we started with this project, it was definitely not possible. So the next step was to look for possibilities on how to enhance the vocals in music without pre-processing. And the idea was to reconfigure the sound coding strategy. So that's the clinical sound processing strategy in the processor, how to reconfigure it to enhance the vocals. So that was the next step. And this was a project in collaboration with Oticon Medical. We worked together with Manuel Segovia and Mariana Fati. And we investigated if singing voice enhancement can be achieved through parameterization of an existing sound coding strategy. All right. So here we see first the block diagram of the sound coding strategy. So this is what is implemented in the sound processor of the cochlear implant. So typically it takes audio from one microphone, then the energy of the signal is measured or estimated, then a Fourier transform is applied. This Fourier transform is applied in windows, so typically of 8-10 milliseconds. So every 8 milliseconds you perform the Fourier transform. Then the resolution of the FFT is reduced by using a spectral envelope estimator, and this will reduce the energies of the FFT into energies in 20 bands approximately. So similar to the critical bands or to the ERB bands, it obtains the spectral envelope in 20 bands. And why 20 bands? Because this implant has 20 electrodes. And then it's in this envelope domain that this cochlear implant applies noise reduction. So this is an algorithm that estimates the statistics of the signal across time. And in this way, it separates what is speech from what is background noise. So this is what is called the voice track algorithm. So these 20 bands have been reduced in noise, and then a channel selection is applied. So we have 20 bands, and then this channel selection block will select n out of m bands. So m is 20, so 20 electrodes, and it will pick up n bands. And the number of bands will be, for example, 8, or it will be 6. So in the end, only 6 bands for each frame of 10 milliseconds are selected, and then these bands are compressed. And for this, it's used an adaptive output compressor. That... Oh, I hear them. Someone has the microphone on, I think. Okay, all good. All right, then, so this compressor, what it's going to do is going to adapt the acoustic dynamic range, in this case of music, to the available dynamic range of the cochlear implant. And then it will generate pulses that are sent to the electrodes. So we thought that to enhance vocals, maybe we can modify the channel selection parameters. So the number of bands that are selected out of the 20 that are available. We thought that we could use the noise reduction algorithm by reducing or by considering background instruments as noise. Maybe this algorithm can enhance the vocals to instruments ratio. And we thought that we could maximize also the dynamic range of music by optimizing the compressor. So that's what is called the voice guard, the compressor. All right, so that was the work of Sina Tamasevi, a PhD student in my group. And let's see the idea here. So the idea is that if we assume that in singing music, in pop music, the original vocals to instruments ratio is positive, so it means that the singing voice is already louder than the background instruments, then reducing the number of bands that are selected will result in an enhancement of the singing voice. So we have singing music is louder than the instruments, and because the sound coding strategy selects some bands, if you select less bands, these bands will be more focused on the singing voice because it has more energy. And the band selection process is based on selecting the maximum energy of the spectrum. So here we see the spectrogram on the bottom left for an electrodogram. So, sorry, I said spectrum is the electrodogram. So the electrodogram is showing us on the vertical axis the electrodes. So we see electrodes from 1 to 20, where 20 is the lowest frequency. And we see in color the current in microamperes. So that's amount of current that is sent to each electrode over time. So this is the representation of the stimulation, which is called electrodogram. And we see it when 12 bands are selected in each frame of the audio, so in each column. So on the left, we have 12 out of 20. On the right, we see 6 out of 20. So what we see is a clear reduction of the amount of stimulation that is sent to the cochlear implant. And because we assume that the singing voice is louder, then selecting less bands will emphasize the energy of the vocals with respect to the background instruments at the level of the electrodogram. For the second hypothesis, we thought that a single channel noise reduction algorithm, like the voice track that I presented, can attenuate the accompaniment of singing music. So on the left, we see the electrodogram when this noise reduction algorithm is off. And on the right, you see what happens when we activate the noise reduction. So we see that the current has been reduced. So you see that on the left, it goes up to 70 in yellow color. On the right, it goes up to 50. So there is a reduction because the background instruments have been reduced, so the energy. And mainly the singing voice is kept, although it's also reduced a little bit. So it remains a question whether this can be beneficial. Okay, so how to assess that indeed these modifications in the N of M and in the activation of the voice track indeed produce an improvement in vocals to instruments ratio. And for this, we decided to compute the vocals to instruments ratio at the level of the electrodogram. So how do we do that? So we have the original multi-tracks, and we separate the vocals from the singing instruments. So vocals is V of T, instruments is I of T. And then we process the vocals and the background instruments independently through the sound coding strategy, so through all this block diagram that I presented you before. And then we obtain the electrodogram for the two elements of the music separated. And then we compute the power of the electrodogram for the vocals and the power of the electrodogram for the accompaniment. And then we obtain an estimation of the vocals to instruments ratio at the electrodogram. Typically, the vocals to instruments ratio that I present you so far, it was modified at the input, but now we are measuring the actual vocals to instruments ratio at the output, by estimating the power of the electrodograms for each of the elements independently. And here we see objectively the enhancement in vocals to instruments ratio by changing the parameterization of the sound coding strategy. So the baseline is a sound coding strategy that selects 8 out of 20 bands and has a noise reduction configuration soft. When we reduce the number of bands from 8 to 6, we see an improvement in the vocals to instruments ratio. That will be the second box. The third box shows the vocals to instruments ratio by activating only the noise reduction. So noise reduction has now switched from soft to medium. And when combining both the reduction of bands selected and the noise reduction, we get a further increase in vocals to instruments ratio. So with this, what we show is that with simple parameterizations of the sound coding strategy, we can achieve an improvement in the vocals to instruments ratio, which actually cochlear implant users prefer on average. Okay, and then the third algorithm that we investigated was this back-end compressor, which is called VoiceGuard, because these compressors of the sound coding strategies of cochlear implants are optimized for speech, actually for speech in quiet, but music is very different from speech in quiet in terms of dynamics. And what this compressor is doing is mapping the input dynamic range at the microphone, which is given in dB hearing level, into the available dynamic range of each electrode. So the dynamic range in the electrodes is the T level and the C level, which are given in microseconds for this processor. So these are actually is microseconds, but is related to charge injected to the electrodes. So we need this compressor, and this compressor defines the slope of the compression, and it defines the place where the compression starts, this knee point. So without going in details, we optimize the knee points and also the slopes of the compressor for music listening instead of for speech in quiet. And the result is what we call the music voice guard that we configured. So here we see the results of using our optimization of this music voice guard. So on the left, we see the percentiles calculated for a database of singing music. And we see that the dynamic range is reduced in comparison to using the music voice guard. So what we see on the horizontal axis are the different electrodes from 1 to 20. And on the vertical axis, what we see is this charge unit, pulse duration. And by optimizing the knee points of the voice guard and the slopes of the compressor, we can optimize the available dynamic range of music for cochlear implant subjects. All right, so we tested 4 programs. It says 3 here, but we have 4. And we tested the reduction of N of M, the activation of the noise reduction, and the optimization of the compressor, and also the combination of all of them. And in terms of experiments, I think we were a bit creative here because we wanted to demonstrate improvements in singing voice perception. And for this reason, we created a test to assess speech understanding of lyrics with background instruments. We also worked with a new melody contour identification task, and also we used a questionnaire to assess the different programs. All right, so let's see these different experiments that we configured. So the test for speech understanding with background instruments was based on the matrix sentence test, the Oldenburg sentence test. So this is a classic speech test. It has 5 words for each sentence. So it's a sentence test with 5 words with different categories: the name, the verb, the numbers, adjectives, and substantives. And then it does combinations of words within each of these categories to create sentences. And then what this test does is to adapt the level of the background noise. So the level of it fixes the level of the background noise, which in this case, it will be a background noise consisting of pop music instruments. And then it will modify the level of the speech material until the subject understands 50%. So what we did is making it a bit more musical. I will play the sound. It will be in German, so you will hear the background instruments, and then you will see you will hear a sentence. Let's see if it works. Oops, again.
Doris malt 9 nasse Sessel.
All right. Could you confirm that you were able to hear the sound?
Yes, we were. Thank you.
Fantastic.
Best rap ever.
All right. Okay. And well, maybe you could, I forgot now the sentence was Britta hat 5 weißes Autos. Maybe it was what is plotted there. So that's what the subject has to repeat. Okay, so here we see the results. So this signal to noise ratio or vocals to instruments ratio necessary to understand 50% is denoted on the vertical axis. So the lower is this number means the better is the performance. And we see that with the baseline sound coding strategy, the performance was around 3. But then when reducing the number of bands from 8 for the baseline to 6, there was an improvement in the speech reception threshold. When activating the noise reduction, the performance was better than the baseline. When optimizing the music dynamic range, there was also an improvement with respect to the baseline. And then the combination of all the 3 previous parameterizations did not result in a further improvement. Yes, so these results show a tendency. So numerically, there were improvements by each of these parameterizations, but the statistics, because there are many conditions that were tested against each other, and after type 2 error correction, they were not significantly different. But I think we could say that there is a tendency towards better performance by optimizing the sound coding strategy. All right, with respect to the second test that we used, it was based on a melody contour identification. So we want to show whether we can improve the identification of melodies, of singing melodies. And for this, we used the test of Galvin, which was simplified by Tabibi in 2019, where we created very simple melodies consisting only of 3 notes that can raise, fall, can be flat, raise, fall, and fall, raise. And what we did is we added background instruments to the melodies, and we also added singing to these melodies. So we took a standard test, a monosyllable speech test that we use in the clinic, and we asked a singer to sing melodies using a single word for a test or using multiple words. So I will show you examples. So I will show you one sample of a melody without background instruments. And it will be in German, but you will hear the words. I go now. Oh. There we go. And then what we did is we also added noise and assessed the effect of adding noise to these melodies. So I will play it. All right, and then what we also did is we assessed the effect of increasing the amount of semitones from note to note. So we conducted the test having 2 semitones of spacing or 4 semitones of spacing between the notes. And as I said, with only 1 word in the melodies or using different words for each note. Okay, so the results are a bit overwhelming. So you see them on the left. And what we see on the top is the result for the different algorithms. And without background noise, background instrument, sorry, on the top left. And on the top right, the effect of adding background instruments. So what we see is that the scores in general dropped when adding background instruments. Actually expected. That was nice to see that. We didn't see any effect of any parameterization. So there was no significant difference in the identification of melodies by reducing the bands of the N of M, activating the noise reduction, or optimizing the dynamic range. What we also observed is that, of course, with 4 semitones as expected and reducing to 2 semitones of spacing, this would be the 2 plots in the middle, there was also a reduction in the identification of melodies. And finally, when adding multiple words into the melody caused a significant drop in the performance in this melody contour identification task. So if you have the same word for each note, it's easier than having different notes. You are changing 2 things, the word and the pitch, and this creates more difficulties. And actually, having 2 semitones of spacing and different words for each note, I think causes that the subjects cannot distinguish these different melodies. All right, and then finally, the results of the questionnaire are shown in this slide. So we asked the subjects which parameterization was more clear in terms of singing voice, and we didn't see any significant difference for different parameterizations. However, in the second question on the right, when we asked them, rate please the overall music enjoyment, we saw significant improvement for the music voice guard. So music enjoyment was improved by optimizing the available dynamic range. This is something that they really perceived through the questionnaire. All right, so to finalize this part, sound coding strategies parameterized based on objective instrumental measures, like this vocals to instruments ratio enhancement at the level of the electrodograms, can mimic complex source separation algorithms as remixers. And this can be used to enhance the singing voice through the reduction of bands in N of M, or it can be achieved through attenuation of the background instruments with noise reduction, like voice track, or through optimization of the dynamic range, like the music voice guard. And I presented an evaluation through measures of singing voice, measures of understanding and identification of melodies. We saw a trend towards improvements in speech understanding of speech understanding, but it's related to music because it has background instruments. However, we didn't see an effect on melody contour identification with any of the parameterizations. So one of the things that we thought it was very promising is to optimize indeed the dynamic range available of the cochlear implant to the dynamic range of the content. So cochlear implants are optimized for speech, but music has a very different dynamic range. Actually, pop music has lower dynamic range than speech in quiet. So by optimizing the dynamic range, it's possible to obtain better electrodograms for cochlear implant users. All right, how much time do I have still? I would like to ask if I have
I
still
think
time.
if you could close within next 5 minutes, then we have time for questions.
5 minutes. Okay, then I will continue with the next study. So I presented some technologies related to enhancing the singing voice. So after that, we wanted to also explore how to enhance the appreciation and perception of instrumental classical music. And this is the PhD of Jonas Althoff. So we have seen different approaches, all based on improving the vocals with respect to the background instruments. But for classical music, there is less research that has been done. And there is the work of Hua, 2021. This person showed that a 6 dB enhancement of bass and treble 4 dB improves music perception. Then there is the work of Nagatil and colleagues that showed that some subjects at individual level preferred a higher gain on melody of classical music, but they could not see effects at population level. And they proposed a different methodology, which consists of reducing the spectral complexity of instrumental music. So that's a different approach, but I think it's really worthwhile to mention it. I will not go in detail, but it's an approach that they try to simplify the harmonic structure of instrumental music, and they show some positive results. But I will not focus on this area. I will focus on the area of remixing, similar to what I showed before for speech or for singing music. So the question is, in classical music, do bilateral cochlear implant users have different remixing preferences as normal hearing listeners for melody, accompaniment, bass, and percussion? So we focused on these elements. And then we wanted to assess in the amplitude domain if they would like to have different gains for melody, accompaniment, bass, and percussion, or in the frequency domain, so spectral domain, whether they would have maybe a preference to low pass filter some of these elements or high pass filter some of these elements to somehow reduce the complexity, or in the spatial domain. So maybe for cochlear implant users could be beneficial that the instruments are presented in different locations, and this could maybe benefit them in terms of separating the instruments, segregating them. So to experiment this, we created two data sets with varying number of instruments. The first data set was already existing. It's the orchestral music data set consisting of nine excerpts from the alto and echoic recordings. And the second data set was created by us. It consisted of trios or trio quartets. We took trios from the Classical Archives MIDI dataset, and we synthesized them with two different arrangements. I will not go in detail. The idea was to avoid biases in the results from different families of instruments. But we also wanted to have percussion. In trios, we don't have percussion. So what we did is we added an element based on the piano that emphasized the onsets of the piano instrument. So that's why we call this dataset trios or trios plus dataset. It's a bit weird, but that's what we did. So all excerpts, so both the orchestral and the trio plus dataset, contain melody, bass, accompaniment, and percussion. And all these elements were balanced using a function called replay gain that somehow equalizes the energy of the different components. Then we use a graphic user interface that we used in the past in the work of Pons for singing music. So the idea is that we have a PC where we display a graphic user interface with different sliders where they can control the gains for each of the elements or the spatial location or the spectral content. And we have an audio interface. And from this audio interface, we can play sounds to normal hearing listeners using headphones, or we can use a Bluetooth connection. This is the so-called TB audio streamer. And this would send the audio streamed to the cochlear implants of bilateral cochlear implant users. And then the users, of course, can control the sliders on the Wii. So the idea is for the spatial domain, they can change the location of the different elements of the music by moving the sliders left and right. For the amplitude, they would control the gain to each of the elements. And for the spectral domain, they would change the low pass or high pass characteristic of the elements. And we did the evaluation in 10 cochlear implant subjects. Cochlear implant subjects were 60 years old on average, and they listened to music 1.2 hours on average, ranging from 0 to 5 hours of daily music listening time. That was quite impressive. And they had a mean implantation experience of 5.7 years. So that means they used the cochlear implant for 5.7 years on average. So they were experienced cochlear implant users and also good performers. The normal hearing listeners that participated in the study were much younger, 28 years old, and listened to music 2.5 hours on average per day, ranging from 1 to 5. And here we see the results. So here we see the results on the spatial domain. And the way we display the results is in terms of bias and spread of the instrument. So spread is how separated in degrees in the spatial domain, how separated are the different instruments. And the bias means whether the subjects had a tendency to put the instruments towards one side. And here it was interesting to see that normal hearing subjects had no bias, as expected, but cochlear implant users had a significant bias towards the right side. So most of the cochlear implant subjects that participated in the study placed the instruments towards the right side. And interestingly, from the 10 subjects, 8 subjects had the best performance cochlear implant side on the right. So from this, we think that cochlear implant users have a tendency to place the instruments towards the best side or best cochlear implant side. In terms of spread, we didn't see differences between normal hearings and cochlear implant subjects. And the results are consistent for the Trio Plus dataset, so with more or less 3 or 4 instruments, and with the orchestral dataset. In terms of amplitude, in the amplitude domain, we didn't see many differences between normal hearings and cochlear implant subjects, so the gain was set close to 0, except for the percussion element in the Trio Plus dataset. In the Trio Plus dataset, we had this very special percussion element because trios, they don't have percussion. So what we did is we put an artificial percussion there. And this artificial percussion was not well, let's say, received by normal hearing listeners that didn't want to have it because it sounds unnatural. So they reduced the gain on the percussion. But the cochlear implant users, probably they didn't care too much. Maybe they could not perceive it well, or maybe they found it useful. So maybe they didn't want to enhance it, but at least they found it useful. So for this reason, we found that in the Trio Plus dataset, cochlear implant users have a significantly higher gain for the percussion part than normal hearing subjects. But for the orchestral dataset, where we have a natural percussion in the orchestra, there was no significant difference between CIs and normal hearing subjects. And then for the spectral domain, we didn't see any effect. So both normal hearing listeners and CA subjects did not have significant preferences in terms of remixing or changing the spectral content of the different elements. Yes, so then what we did is we looked in more detail at differences between frequent and occasional music listeners. So we divided the cochlear implant group into 2 groups by separating them on subjects that were listening to music more than 1 hour per day and subjects that were listening less than 1 hour per day. And then we found interesting differences because then what we saw is in the spatial domain, frequent subjects that listen frequently to music significantly separated more the instruments in the auditory scene. So they probably are more used to listen to music, and they are more experienced listeners. So they tend to separate the instruments to perceive them better. We also saw differences. They frequently, subjects that listen frequently to music prefer also gain in the bass and in the percussion with respect to the occasional subjects listening to music. And in the spectral domain, again, we didn't see any effect. So that shows us that there are individual preferences to remix music instrumental music. Okay, so to summarize this part, what we see is that for Western instrumental classical music, CA users had a remixing preference bias towards the right side for spatial panic, probably because the right side is the best one. There was no remixing preferences for gain on melody for cochlear implant users. And in our study, different remixing preferences for the groups of occasional and frequent music listening CA users was observed. So we see increased gains for bass and percussion and also wider spread. Okay, and now to finalize the last results. So now what we are working on is on how to create a system that could be beneficial for cochlear implant users. So we have seen that individual subjects have different preferences, and this sounds a bit more futuristic, but what we are trying to do is to use brain signals to help AI algorithms to perform the remix of cochlear implant users. So this is the idea of using this brain-informed source separation that has been proposed by others, but as far as I know, not in the cochlear implant domain and maybe not for music. So we are exploring whether we could use brain signals to inform AI algorithms to separate elements of music. So for this, we are using a well-known paradigm, which is based on a selective auditory attention decoding paradigm. This has been used in the domain of speech. So it's a very well-known paper by Sullivan, 2015, that we could reproduce in cochlear implant subjects. So we showed that it is possible to decode selective auditory attention in cochlear implant users with EEG. And in music, there is work by Cantizani, 2019, that already showed in normal hearing listeners that it's possible to decode the attention to different elements from EEG in music. But for cochlear implant users, it remains to be shown if this is possible. And this is what we wanted to assess. So we created a data set of recordings. So we recorded 32 minutes of duets synthesized with clarinet and cello. we presented these instruments dichotically, so independently to each ear, and then we assessed the attention to each instrument in blocks of 8 minutes. And we had 8 normal hearing subjects and 8 bilateral cochlear implant subjects in the study. So here we see the paradigm. We presented 2 instruments dichotically to the subjects, and they had to attend one of the instruments, so cello or clarinet. Then we recorded EEG. We had to do some post-processing to remove the artifact. From the audio, we extracted features, like, for example, the envelope of the attended audio and the envelope of the unattended audio. And then we delayed these audio features with respect to the EEG. So the delays are called lags. So there are delays from 0 to 500 milliseconds. And for each lag, we created a decoder. So this decoder, what does is reconstructs from the EEG the features, so the envelopes of the attended and the unattended audio. And all this is based on the idea that when you pay attention to one audio stream, then this audio stream becomes more enhanced in your brain, in your cortical signals, and the unattended signal is attenuated. And this is what we are trying to show here. So we run correlations between the reconstructed audio from EEG with the attended audio, which should be larger, the correlation, because it's more present in the cortical activity, and the correlation to the unattended audio between EEG and the actual audio should be lower because it's unattended. So here we see the results in all 8 normal hearing listeners. We see the correlation coefficient to the attended audio in red and to the unattended audio in blue. And we see significant differences between both correlation coefficients. And that means that it is possible to decode selective attention decoding when 2 instruments are presented dichotically to normal hearing listeners. But on the right, it was really nice to see that this is also possible in cochlear implant subjects. We see that the correlation coefficients are now much lower. So from correlations of 0.05 in normal hearings, we go to 0.01 at most in CIs, but there is a significant difference between the attended and the unattended correlation coefficient in bilateral CI users. So to conclude, we've seen that it is possible to decode selective auditory attention in CI users. Selective auditory attention decoding is more difficult for music than for speech, even for normal hearing listeners. Well, we needed some fancy algorithms to remove the artifact in CIs. I will not explain this, but we think that these results show first steps towards a brain-computer music interface. So to summarize the whole talk, I've presented some singing voice enhancement based on music concerts and new contents that we created. We have seen that we can create AI, low latency low complexity source separation algorithms to improve music appreciation for CI users. However, we cannot implement these AI algorithms in current sound processors. It will be possible soon, but not yet. So one possibility is to optimize the sound coding strategies for singing voice enhancement by modifying the N of M band selection, by activating voice track or noise reduction algorithms, and by optimizing the compressor. So we have seen that optimizing the dynamic range of music to the available dynamic range of the CI through a multiband compressor improves music appreciation of singing music. And we have also seen that if we go to the instrumental domain, classic instrumental music, CI users have different preferences to remix instrumental music at individual levels. So they have individual preferences. And finally, looking more into the future, we are working on a brain-computer music interface based on selective attention decoding that tries to inform source separation algorithms to separate music elements and make music more accessible for CIs. So with this, I finish my talk. We have this website, musicforci.com, where you can visit and listen to the music concerts and the recordings. You can see them, and also our website. So I would like to thank the DFG, the German Research Foundation, for funding for this music project, and also to my group. And now I'm open for questions. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Waldo. That was a very rich talk. Thank you so much for all these details and this great overview of all the work you did in this field. We do have a tiny amount of time for questions, but due to the technical problems, we need to hurry up. So if anybody has a quick question, so please type it in the chat or just come on stage. Okay. Well, let me at least. Oh, wow, there's a long question. Ben Smith is asking. He's wondering how fatigue would affect listeners in both visually assisted listening scenarios and listening to potentially overcompressed vocals. He uses bilateral hearing aids and often finds that lip reading has an effect on that.
Yes. Well, not in the music domain, but in the speech domain, we are looking into effects of pre-processing on listening effort and cognitive load. And there is a large literature on this area showing that indeed noise reduction algorithms can be helpful to reduce the fatigue when listening to speech in noisy environments. So I could imagine that such a brain-computer interface that facilitates or makes the music more accessible for CA listeners could help in reducing fatigue. But I guess in music, when you're listening to music, you are also trying to enjoy the music. And if you are exhausted by listening to music, you could stop. No? But I think these are areas that need to be explored. And it's a really nice area to research. So cognitive load, listening effort when listening to music.
I would be interested, your current your C grant is on electroacoustic interactions, right? So with music, you have typically much more strong bass components compared to speech. So is this something of relevance to music as well, or are you exploring this in your current work as well?
Yeah, so these are at the moment independent projects. So the electric acoustic interactions are more at physiological level. So we are trying to understand. So this is in subjects that receive electric stimulation, but also retain acoustic hearing. So these people receive in the same ear electric and acoustic stimulation. So we are trying to understand where in the cochlea the interaction between both stimulation modalities takes place. For instance, it could be that when you stimulate electrically and acoustically in the same cochlea, that there is interaction at the level of the hair cells. It could be that there is interaction at the level of the auditory nerve, or it could be that there is more central interaction. But first, we are looking more at the fundamental interaction mechanisms, so really at the level of the physiology of the auditory system, and we are looking less at more cognitive demanding tasks such as speech in noise or music understanding. But there is so music perception. So there is, of course, a connection between both, but we are not there yet to establish this link. We are at the very basics.
Cool. All right. Any further questions?
I had just a quick question about, I don't know whether you can hear me. I can't see me at the moment. Just about why it would be that cochlear implant users would have preference for having the instruments over there on the right. Is it just the case that for each of those instances that that was their better ear? Or is there something else going on?
Exactly. So 10 subjects participated in that study, and we looked at the best ear. So which one was the best ear for these 8 participants? And indeed, it was the right one. We could not demonstrate. It would have been nicer to also have a large group of subjects that had the best ear on the left side to fully confirm the results. This we didn't have. But presumably the reason is that 8 of the 10 subjects had the best ear on the right side.
Well, thank you for your talk. I think we should move on now. But yeah, thank you very much. And look forward to it was very rich, and I look forward to listening back and being able to absorb all of the detail there. Some fascinating research and very forward thinking as well. I do have some other questions, but I think we'll have to move on for now. So it's with great pleasure that I introduce Scott Bannister. Scott Bannister is, if you want to come on and share your slides, and Waldo, if you will stop sharing your slides and your screen.
Yeah, thank you everyone. And yeah, thank you everyone. And please send me an email if you want to ask me some questions. Bye-bye.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, so a pleasure to introduce Scott. Scott is a postdoc working on the Cadenza project, which is seeking to improve music listening experiences for people with a hearing loss. Scott has a background in music technology and music psychology. He has lots of different interests, but predominantly has expertise in emotional responses to music and in particular strong emotional responses to music and chills. He also has research interests in empathy, social cognition, and psychophysiology. But more recently, working on the Cadenza grant, he has been working with me and the rest of the team on looking at the perceptual experiences of people with hearing loss. I feel very privileged to be working with you, Scott, on this project. And today, Scott's going to be talking about our first Cadenza challenge and some of the sensory panel work that we've been doing around that. Okay, thanks, Scott.
Thanks very much for the introduction, Alenka, and to you and Kai for bringing me into this to give a bit of what I see as a kind of update on the first Cadenza machine learning challenge. And as Alenka just alluded to, then a lot of my work on the Cadenza project is very much focused on the listener experience, or these subjective perceptual experiences and their evaluations, in this case, of what machine learning systems achieve in processing music samples to improve listening experiences for people with a hearing loss. So I'll assume, unless I hear otherwise, that everybody can see these slides and that things progress clearly. So just a very brief overview of the Cadenza project. Really, what we seek, what our main aim is ultimately is to develop novel signal processing strategies to improve music listening for people with a hearing loss, for listeners with a hearing loss. And I guess there are two broad streams to this work and to this project. So we have a series of machine learning challenges in which we invite entrants, researchers, people with expertise or interests to address certain listening scenarios with the aim of processing music to improve the experience. And another stream of work which is very much integrated with the challenges, but it involves a lot of the research that I do, is this kind of perceptual work, perceptual studies, to really develop and really understand the perceptual experiences of music for people with a hearing loss, but also think about ways we might capture those experiences, which then really allows us to evaluate machine learning systems in a way that is meaningful, ultimately. So really, this talk will focus on the first Cadenza challenge, or CAD1. So this was run a couple of years ago now, and we are kind of in the process, or I am in the process, as we'll see later in this talk, of really just finishing up the analysis of the subjective evaluation related to this challenge. But initially, we presented two scenarios to challenge entrants. The first one was that we have a listener who is engaging with music unaided, so without their hearing aids, and listening over a set or pair of headphones. And the task was really communicated as a demix and remix task. So we take a stereo signal, demix that into 4 key components, so vocals, drums, bass, and other, and that's for both left and right in the stereo field. So we have 8 mono signals. And then the challenge entrants are tasked with remixing or downmixing to optimize for a target listener with hearing loss, and that's in relation to their kind of hearing loss profile as well, their individual hearing profile. The second scenario was listening to music through hearing aids in a moving car, so it's kind of introducing a bit of background noise, so music in noise. That's the kind of scenario we're looking at there. But it's worth mentioning that I include this mainly for broad context, but we'll be focusing on this first scenario today, so listening to music unaided over headphones. Just to give you a very broad schematic sense, if you like, as to the process, and this is from a preprint from Road Dabike, a colleague of mine on the Cadenza project, which is really just visualizing a kind of baseline solution to this first scenario. So the very rough idea is that we take a piece of music, a piece of stereo music, and then challenge entrants are tasked with demixing that into vocals, drums, bass, and other left and right. And then they're tasked ultimately with remixing those individual stems together, applying some amplification, frequency dependent amplification potentially, or alternative strategies to compensate for elevated hearing thresholds that are associated with hearing loss. So remix those together into a stereo audio signal, and then that stereo signal is objectively evaluated and also subjectively evaluated by a panel of hearing aid users as well. And they have these steps all consider a kind of random listener generation, so an audiogram, if you like, or hearing profile that needs to be considered here to optimize the solution. And a final thing to mention is that challenge entrants have the opportunity to remix or rebalance the different stems in the remixing stage based on the kind of gain targets and so on, or they can also choose to stick with the kind of original gain balances in the stereo signal as well. So that's a very brief visual overview, and I can talk a little bit more about some of these evaluation components shortly as well. So in CAD 1, challenge entrants were working with training and validation sets and data from MusDB 18HQ, which contains a training set of 100 songs, which also includes the kind of separate stems for the vocals, drums, bass, and other. So when we're thinking about these stems, it may give you the impression as the kind of music that's involved in these data sets as well. It does vary slightly. We kind of have some electronic pieces, reggae pieces, and some quite heavy metal pieces as well. But I think it's a fair representation of the data set to say a lot of the music that we're working with here is very much in that kind of pop rock, Western pop rock genre style. So entrants use this data for kind of training and the validation stages, and then they're evaluated using the 50 songs in the evaluation/test set from MusDB 18, in which the full songs are processed. So that's a kind of rough overview of the data. The key aspects here for today is the evaluation of these challenge machine learning systems. So we have an objective evaluation, as you might have seen in the schematic, where we use the Hearing Aid Audio Quality Index, or the HAQI, and these results are presented in that preprint I mentioned as well. Now, this is an intrusive metric, so it compares a degraded audio signal, for example, to a reference signal. So in this case, it would be the kind of original music with the default for HAQI, the NALA amplification applied to address these different hearing thresholds, elevated thresholds. There's a few caveats with using this. It's not necessarily the perfect metric, but it's one of the very few available that seemed applicable for the challenge context. But it's not really been used before to explore demixed signals and looking at kind of quality of various mono sources that have been source separated. And also it's an intrusive metric, as I've mentioned, which ultimately means that if a challenge entrant wants to change the amplification strategy or remix things in a different way in contrast to the reference. Now, this may be a good strategy. We don't necessarily know. It could be a good strategy for the actual, the subjective evaluation, the hearing aid listeners, but it's likely to penalize the systems in terms of HAQI performance. So there are several caveats to using this, but that's how it was used. And in terms of subjective evaluation alongside this, we had a listener panel, as I mentioned, of hearing aid users who were asked to listen to these music samples processed by the machine learning systems for their hearing loss profiles and evaluate them in terms of ultimately music audio quality. And that really is the focus for the remainder of the talk. However, there's a kind of a question as to how, on what metrics or how do we ask listeners to rate these samples? What are the important dimensions, the perceptual dimensions of audio quality? And this was not necessarily a known attribute that we had to really think carefully about what we would ask participants in that listener panel to do in relation to these music samples. So there's a lot of work, broadly speaking, on audio quality evaluation. There's also a kind of lot of work on hearing aid processing strategies and how different strategies might be preferred or lead to better versus poor audio quality. Across these studies, that might look at kind of compression strategies or bandwidth changes or spectral processing. Historically, if the focus on music is pretty rare, there are studies that might include music signals, but they are not the focus of the research. And they often evaluate audio quality at quite a holistic level, so good versus poor, or even at the level of preference, whether it kind of, if you think of listening to two signals and just being asked which one is better compared to the other. So these are often the kind of levels of analysis, but we know that audio quality perception is multidimensional, and there are underpinning perceptual attributes for this. And there's a great chapter from Chris Pike from 2019 that reviews a lot of these perceptual attributes in relation that have been explored in areas of spatial sound reproduction, multi-channel binaural reproduced sound, room acoustics, comparisons between different hearing aid models as well. And what we do see in the literature is that there is some convergence in terms of these underlying perceptual attributes of audio quality. And maybe one useful source here is the sound wheel from Pedersen and Zakharov in 2015, which really brings some of these attributes and categories and dimensions together. So you can see we kind of have timbral, spatial, and artifacts as the kind of main labeled categories, but we can touch on elements like loudness, dynamics, different elements in the frequency range, treble, mid-range, and bass. Then we've got localization, reverberance, these kinds of elements. And then in the kind of upper left quadrant, we have the noise, the signal-related artifacts, distortion, clipping, buzzing, shrillness, and roughness as well, some of which will be relevant for evaluating the CAD1 entrance as well. However, in relation to kind of music audio quality perception and hearing loss, what we find is that whether the focus is on hearing loss or not, most existing research tends to use audio quality attributes that have not been developed or derived from the perspectives of people who hear through hearing loss as well. There are some exceptions to this. So there's some earlier work from Gabrielson, for example, in the 70s and 80s. But ultimately, I think the majority of attributes and dimensions of audio quality have not been kind of developed from that perspective of hearing loss. And I think we thought that was important to consider in the first instance. And as I already mentioned, a lot of research on hearing loss and hearing aid processing strategies, for example, rarely positions folk music as the focus. A lot of it, for example, would be on speech. So we needed to develop a listener-driven understanding of music audio quality from the perspective of hearing loss. So this is building us up towards how we can run this listener panel for the CAD1 challenge. So we carried out a couple of years ago what we called a sensory evaluation study, which was published last year. And the aim of this was ultimately to improve our understanding of these key perceptual attributes or dimensions of music audio quality for hearing aid users, and potentially develop some metrics and measurement tools for CAD1, as we'll see today, and potentially for broader future research as well. What we wanted to do is capture the multidimensionality of audio quality perception, but crucially, we needed this and we wanted this to be inductive and listener-driven. So this process of developing the dimensions, the scales, it's driven by those hearing aid users in this study. And as researchers, we kind of facilitate and just make sure we stay on track, because these discussions can get extremely detailed. So we were really there just as facilitators. So these scales that we end up using, developed by the hearing aid users. To give you a broad overview of this, we had an individual elicitation task initially with 12 hearing aid users, in which we presented them with a variety of different musical stimuli, and we asked them to listen to all of them with their hearing aids in, and then all of them with the hearing aids taken out as well. And for each sample, we asked them to provide 3 single-word terms to describe the sounds that they've heard. And from this, we collated a large amount of different terms. We had this large perceptual space, if you like, of audio quality. From that space, we ran 3 focus groups. The first one was focused mainly on just reducing that term space in the first instance, so getting rid of synonyms, antonyms, and maybe terms that felt less relevant in relation to audio quality for the group, and maybe start grouping some of these terms together in relation to patterns or similarities. In the second focus group, we really continued with that grouping of the terms and aimed to finalize these clusters, which led us to the final focus group, in which the hearing aid users, or this sensory panel, as we called them in the study, develops the perceptual scales, the way of measuring these key groupings and perceptual dimensions of audio quality. So to give you a brief sense as to what we found, but like I said, I would direct you to the paper for the full details. The individual elicitation gave us a lot of different terms, 373 unique descriptors. And I have a table here of the kind of top 20, I believe, most frequently reported terms. And then at the start of focus group 1, what we decided to do rather arbitrarily, but just to make this a task that was doable rather than a space of 300 plus terms, which would have been really difficult to navigate. We just started with terms that had been used 4 or more times, and that was just shy of 90 terms. So we have this word cloud here that was given to the participants in the first focus group, and we started from there and narrowed down. Well, these are just a few images from the actual focus groups and what we were trying to do. So this is from that word cloud. We have the beginnings of some groupings of the terms. You can see these are kind of the early stages, but what's interesting, even looking back on this, is that you can see in the bottom left of the whiteboard, for example, there were some really intricate discussions and about kind of words like muddled and indistinct versus muddy and congested, and do they mean the same thing, or are they subtly different in some way? I mean, these discussions, if you give them the freedom, and I don't mean them as in the participants, but if you just give freedom to a process like this, those discussions will take a very, 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 very long time, and maybe we don't get anywhere so easily. But you can see those little complexities, even just looking at this whiteboard here, the kind of echoes of those complicated discussions. This was actually at the end of the second focus group where the sensory panel had really narrowed down the terms and started to group these in ways that they collectively understood and could agree on. There were still some points of disagreement. You can see distortion at the bottom. Thinking about something like distortion is quite complex because it can be an aesthetic term for things like metal and other kind of heavy rock styles, but it can also be related to signal artifacts, as we saw on the sound wheel. And you can also see in the bottom left there, kind of wide, narrow, these terms are not necessarily straightforward to understand. And in the end, the sensory panel thought they were too broad, they were applicable to too many different elements of audio quality perception that they might not have been so useful for them in the end. But this is what we ended up with at the end of the whole process. So after the 3 focus groups, so we have a series of attributes here, which I can leave just for 10 seconds or so you can have a very brief glance at the descriptions, short definitions. But we have clarity, harshness, distortion, spaciousness, treble, middle, and bass strength. We also had a kind of frequency balance alternative. So that's a kind of 1 scale alternative to those 3 frequency-related items. And then perceived audio quality or basic audio quality at the end as a kind of overall collective understanding from the perspective of these hearing aid users as to what music audio quality is to them. Now, importantly, this gave us some measurement tools and some metrics to actually move ahead with the CAD1 context to think about how a listener panel can rate music samples that have been processed by machine learning systems. So to come back to CAD1, we have this listener panel subjective evaluation, and there are 8 machine learning systems that went through to this evaluation process. And I give a very rough summary in this table here of the 8 systems. You'll see that there's kind of different algorithms that have been used. The remix column really, it captures whether these entrants decided to rebalance the gains of those different VDBO stems or whether they kept them as they were originally. And the amplification relates to ultimately the kind of amplification procedure they used, and the majority used NLR like it was included in Hacky, maybe plus a few different variations such as E14, the low frequency kind of attenuation decrease, so those bass frequencies being, not being attenuated as much as maybe NLR might describe. The main thing to mention here is that E1 is the kind of the baseline system which entrants were tasked with trying to better and beat in terms of performance. And E21 is ultimately just a do-nothing system. So there's really nothing being done to the signal. It's the original signal as is. So on this listener panel, we had 52 bilateral hearing aid users. We had hearing loss severity that ranged from no impairment, and I use that term carefully because it's fairly arbitrary. These participants, I think there were maybe two participants categorized as no impairment, just through the kind of calculation process used from Hume's 2019. But they were bilateral hearing aid users. They had hearing loss. So we're really talking from mild through to a couple of participants on the more severe end of hearing loss. And it's worth mentioning, just for transparency, that in terms of the analysis that we'll see, overall participants were collapsed into 3 groups, so mild, moderate, and moderately severe hearing loss severity. And that's really because we only had 1 or 2 participants on those extremities, so it just simplified the communication. And I'll just give you a visual aggregation here across participants in those categories. In terms of the audiograms. In terms of the music samples that we used the 50 songs from the MusDB 18 evaluation set, but we selected a subset of 25 for the listener panel, mainly to limit the duration of the study. And we selected those 25 songs manually and really to just capture the genre coverage and diversity. Like I said, it's worth mentioning most of these songs kind of in that pop rock area of style, but we do have some electronic pieces, some heavy metal pieces, which are kind of a spoiler that they were not so well liked, and we have a couple of rap and reggae pieces as well. So we extracted from each of those 25 songs a 15-second sample, and that's what participants were asked to listen to. So they actually rated each sample for every system, which ends up being a lot of listening. So 25 samples across 8 systems, 200 samples being rated. And, this is a big task. And at every opportunity, I'd like to thank, the listener panel for their commitment with this research. It's several hours of listening, but also worth mentioning they were not asked to do this in one sitting. They had, 4 to 6 weeks, and they ultimately broke it down in whatever way they saw best. And another thing to say is that all participants had the same set of headphones to listen to, so we attempted to kind of control for that, those playback differences really, which was important. Okay, so this is just a visual outline of that iterative process where participants go through the 200 music samples. So they listen to the sample. They had the opportunity to listen a few times, so maybe kind of 3 or 4 times, because what we're asking them to do here is not necessarily a straightforward task. These perceptual dimensions are not always straightforward to perceive in the music and really think carefully about the evaluation. So a few auditions of a sample was quite important to provide. And what you'll see here is that they were asked to provide 6 ratings for each sample. So we asked them to talk about clarity, or provide ratings for clarity, harshness, distortion, frequency balance instead of treble, middle, bass strength. Ultimately, this was derived from some pilot work we did with the listener panel, and they felt that this single scale captured most of what they were trying to capture with those 3 frequency scales, and it ultimately made the task a little bit more streamlined. Then we have the kind of basic audio quality, the overall audio quality, and we have an additional rating there for liking or enjoyment preference, that dimension, which isn't so pertinent for the analysis I'm showing today, although we're still looking into that a little bit. But I think we think it helps participants distinguish the kind of description of audio quality from their more subjective opinions on whether they like the music or not. So we thought it was, at the very least, a kind of helpful heuristic to include in the study. So I have a couple of examples here. Let me know if this first one doesn't play. It's not essential that they play, but I always try and include a little bit of music, as poor as this might be to some ears. But these are just original versions of some of the excerpts that we had. So here's the first one. Okay, the second one, second example.
Ending communication. Breathing is warm, neck and caressing his soft hair. Could this be love?
And the last one.
The stormy seas only take the toll.
Okay, you can imagine I've heard these quite a lot over the last 2 years, so I was actually hesitant to include them and play them. But anyway, I've done it now. There's an earworm for me somewhere there for the rest of the day. Okay, so these remaining slides over the next 5 minutes or so are really a kind of overview of a work in progress analysis of this listener panel evaluation data. So firstly, I just want to spend a couple of slides on some descriptives in relation to the machine learning system and the hearing loss severity level categories here. So we've got the columns here for basic audio quality, clarity, harshness, and so on. And a few things maybe to point out here is that the baseline system, in terms of overall audio quality, was not necessarily beaten by the challenge entrance systems. It's worth saying that I think that baseline system uses a kind of state-of-the-art source separation algorithm, and it might have been the case that the baseline is just maybe a little bit too difficult to beat. However, there are several systems that are really approaching the same kind of performance. So E5, E12, and E17 as well. And it's worth mentioning we're still trying to kind of interpret this data in relation to the systems themselves as well. And there's a bit of a challenge there for us to understand, how far can we go in understanding what exactly the systems are doing, and these machine learning systems, and how do we interpret that in relation to the subjective data. Another pattern which I've not made visually clear here, but I think might be quite interesting in relation to some of the subsequent slides, is that the first 4 systems, so 1 through to 14, they seem to score quite highly on distortion in relation to the other 4, so in relation to E16 through to 22. And that means participants are feeling that there's more distortion in the signals that they're listening to. So intuitively, maybe not such a good thing, right? More distortion, probably. We know that it kind of relates negatively to audio quality. And then in terms of hearing loss severity, I think the main thing to point out here is again perhaps what we would expect here, that those participants on the listener panel who have a more kind of mild hearing loss, they're on the whole their kind of ratings of audio quality are not very high, but higher in relation to those more severe levels of hearing loss, which, given the perceptual consequences of hearing loss severity, we might expect. So that's just a brief overview of some of the ratings in relation to systems. A further bit of descriptive work we've done is just plot the BAQ scores in relation to those Hacky remix scores as well, so the objective evaluation scores. And I think the main thing just to say here, and you'll see I'm building a bit of a narrative in this analysis because we are still in that phase of interpreting and thinking about the meaning behind the numbers and the data. But what strikes me here is, again, those first 4 systems, E1 through to 14, in terms of these box plots here with the BAQ scores, which have been binned into kind of tenths, so 0.1 through to 1, and the Hacky scores on the y-axis. There seems to be a relationship between the two for those 4 systems, but that's not clearly the case for E16 through to E22. And again, we're not sure why that is, but there's something about that first grouping of systems in relation to that second grouping of systems, not just here, but in relation to those distortion values as well. There are some consistent separations between 2 groups of systems. And that's actually clear when we look at audio quality ratings at the levels of the 8 machine learning systems and the 3 hearing loss severity categories as well. And what we find is that there's a significant interaction between the machine learning system and the hearing loss severity. And what that ultimately means is that there's an effect in which machine learning systems and the kind of audio quality scores that they produce in the listener panel is as you might expect variable depending on the hearing loss severity levels. But what's interesting here potentially is that this effect actually largely seems to be driven by results in the moderately severe hearing loss category, and it's here where systems E16 through to 22 actually start to outperform the other 4 systems. And I think there's something that needs to be delved into here to understand exactly what's going on there. But again, in another visualization, in a different kind of statistical bit of testing, we find this distinction. And the last slide I would include here for this kind of work in progress is that we thought it might be beneficial to look at the signal properties of these processed music samples from machine learning systems. So we selected a series of audio signal features and we ran a kind of principal components analysis to reduce that kind of dimensional space, if you like. And I think we have at the moment some relatively interpretable principal components 3. The first one relates to kind of loudness, clipping, and spectral flux in an audio signal. The second appears to be related to spectral centroid and flatness. And the final principal component appears to be related to spectral skew. And the main thing I want to highlight from this element of the analysis, which we're still working on, is that although in the second and third principal components, visually at least, there doesn't appear to be any immediate patterns, although you have in second principal component systems 16 and 21, they seem to be quite different to the rest. But in terms of principal component 1, the loudness, the clipping elements, what you see again is those first 4 systems, E1 through to 14, as the hearing loss severity levels increase. So if you think back to the audiograms that these machine learning systems are having to work with to optimize their solutions, our current reading of this is that as hearing loss severity increases, those first 4 systems are kind of increasing the loudness and the clipping in the signals that are being processed for those audiograms as well. And we're thinking that is even correlated back to that descriptive table where the distortion values from the listener panel, the distortion ratings are higher for those 4 systems. So there's a bit of meaning, I think, that we're piecing together here in terms of what might be going on. But like I say, this is kind of in progress. And I guess to finish, the first thing to say is that the analysis of this CAD1 listener evaluation data is to be finalized, and we're kind of approaching the end of that process now. But yeah, I think there's a challenge there for us to really understand and interpret the data in terms of what it might mean in relation to the machine learning systems, the entrants, what they've tried to do. But once we can develop those interpretations, I think that'll be quite important moving forward as well. But just to finish, in terms of the Cadenza project more broadly, the next steps, firstly to say that we've since run a second Cadenza machine learning challenge, or CAD2, as you might imagine it to be called. and that closed last month. And we had 2 tasks or scenarios in relation to that challenge. The first one was to improve the intelligibility of lyrics in music for a person with hearing loss who would be listening over headphones, but maximize lyric intelligibility whilst minimizing the loss to audio quality. Because if it's just about lyric intelligibility, one solution for a machine learning system would be to get rid of the background music completely. But you can imagine the kind of obvious issues from a listener perspective there. For that task, we have a second listener panel, which is imminently beginning in the next couple of weeks. And the second task is for challenge entrants to take a stereo recording of small classical ensembles, so string quartets, for example, and source separate and change the levels of the instruments to match some arbitrary target gains. We have no listener panel for this work because ultimately we don't really know what gain balances are preferred. And we have a kind of separate classical rebalancing study plan to maybe get some data on what people might prefer, or whether it'd be useful to allow this rebalancing, what would be preferred. And finally, just to say that we're thinking about CAD 3, the third Cadenza challenge as well. And the main thing to say here is that one of the key messages we get from the Cadenza participants, the sensory panel, the listener panel, everybody we work with really, is the need for solutions for classical music, because classical music is a big part of a lot of people's lives. It has its own signal properties and difficulties. It was mentioned in the previous talk that pop rock music, for example, for pop rock music has this kind of narrow dynamic range, for example, but that's not the case with classical music, especially live. The dynamic range can be extreme in comparison to other signals. But we run into issues with the data sets we can use for machine learning. We need a lot of data. It needs to be openly accessible under the right licensing, these practical issues that are frustrating to deal with. But I think we're getting there slowly. And yeah, I guess a general call is we'd welcome any suggestions on that front as well. But otherwise, thank you for listening. Thanks to our funders, the EPSRC, and to all of our project partners as well, RNID, Logitech, Google, Hannover, BBC, University of Oldenburg. And for that, I'll save my voice any further torment and welcome any questions.
Thank you very much, Scott. Okay, so I'm just looking at the chat. I don't think there's any specific questions at the moment. Perhaps while everybody's thinking of a question for you, maybe could you perhaps just go into a little more detail about how you extracted the features of the audio? Just thinking back to your the a couple of slides ago.
Sure. I mean, we extracted the features with some rather generic MATLAB functions in a lot of cases. So I think ultimately it's one of our colleagues, Bruno Fazenda, who performed this. But yeah, there's not much to say in that we didn't necessarily use any specialized tools for the feature extraction. But it's also worth saying that our starting point for these signal features was really just a little bit of intuition. So one process we could have taken, and we have thought about this, is to take a lot of these different signal processing or feature extraction toolboxes, MIR toolbox, other kind of tools, extract all the features, and then run some dimensionality reduction with a host of different features. The way we have done this for now is that we selected just a series of signal features that we thought, based on the literature and based on what people, what the hearing aid users that we've worked with in the Cadenza project, for example, told us as well, that we thought could be important. So, we were looking at the kind of spectral centroid, flux, flatness, loudness, the crest factor as well, harshness, which was operationalized by Bruno as a kind of the ratio of spectral energy from between 2 kilohertz and 4 kilohertz and the whole of the spectrum. So really looking at that kind of, well, as the participants in the sensory panel described, that kind of harsh treble related perceptual experience as well. So that's really how we did it. It was a series of generic functions in MATLAB. And I think the main thing to say is that we've actually selected. We haven't just taken a huge set of features. We've started with a feature set that we thought could be important. But there are other ways of doing this. That's just the one approach we've taken so far.
Thanks, Scott. Thanks. Great talk. I would be interested in whether you looked at inter-rater correlations for your listener panel.
Good question. We haven't looked at inter-rater correlations. No, we've looked at the correlational work we've done so far is mainly kind of inter-rating correlations. So between clarity, between harshness, distortion, frequency balance, and so on. And what you find, I mean, the findings there are very intuitive. That we find these strong correlations between audio quality and clarity in the positive kind of direction. We find them fairly strong in relation to distortion and audio quality, but in a negative kind of relationship there as well. But no, we haven't really looked at inter-rater correlations, and that might be something we can look at. We've been exploring a little bit, for example, whether participants change their behavior, over the samples as well, because it's worth reiterating that this is not a straightforward task. These perceptual dimensions are not always straightforward to grapple with. They come with their definitions that the sensory panel developed, but it isn't a straightforward task, and there will be a learning process involved as people go through the samples. So we envisage that maybe participant behaviors might change from sample 1 through to 200, those kinds of elements. So it's kind of that within rater consistency, if you like. We don't find anything unusual, to be honest. I think what we might have thought is that there's a kind of a wide range of usage in the ratings, and then it kind of narrows down as people go through samples, or maybe the kind of vice versa pattern of that. But it's a good suggestion, Kai. I think that's something we should easily be able to do, and we'll see what it might be able to tell us.
I mean, there was a classical instance of low inter-rater correlation with music information retrieval research. So they had their MIREX competitions, so their annual competitions between their systems, and I think that one was on music similarity. And they only, after evaluating all their machine learning systems, they realized that the inter-rater correlation was actually excruciatingly low and sort of was vanishing. So the whole exercise wasn't really worth it. And for a tricky task like this, I think it makes sense to just have that in mind, that people might not agree on samples.
Yeah, good point.
See that.
Thanks for your question, Kai. There's another one in the chat. Vincent says, did I spot correctly that none of the... Oh, do you want to come on, Vincent? And come.
Of course I can, yeah. Hi, Scott. Thanks a lot for the presentation. Very interesting. You showed this table of results where you had the different ratings in terms of distortion and so on. And the rightmost column there was overall preference, or like how much people liked it. And it seemed like the unprocessed version excelled there over all the complex machine learning systems.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. It's a good point you've raised here, and I think ultimately my answer here is that we are kind of, it is counterintuitive, and I think we're in the process still of really understanding what this data might mean and how we interpret what's going on here. My immediate impression here, and it makes me think about those first four systems, E1 through to 14, that are kind of increasing the loudness and those aspects with increasing hearing loss severity. But as we know, it's not as simple as turning things up, right? It's far more complicated than this, and I suspect, Yeah, I think it is quite surprising. We like I said, we haven't presented much data on the liking element here, but it's something we need to be looking at in the analysis. Because you see that it won't exactly correlate with audio quality. There'll be a little bit of distinction there. But I think this might reflect a little bit of what we know from the literature so far about music and hearing loss. And I'm thinking about some of the compression studies as well, in which you find that preference is for kind of compression that approaches linear processing, so that kind of minimal compression. But that is an open question. Ultimately, I think this is something we need to interpret and think about. Ultimately, what this means. You're right to say we kind of have this do nothing system, and it's not, as we might expect, the kind of worst performing scenario here. So that's something we need to look closely at. But that's really all that I can say in response to that for now.
Yeah, okay. Maybe a follow-up question then. So the fundamental assumption was that if someone uses the system of taking the original signal and then splitting it out into each of these different stems and then mixing it together again, this is a good approach to improve listening experience for these people, right? I'm curious where the idea originally came from. Why did you put this into the Cadenza challenge as basically a precondition for how people should do the music processing?
It's a good question. I think there are a couple of reasons. Some of them are driven by the kind of potential of kind of consumer devices as well. So not just thinking about hearing aids, but thinking about kind of rebalancing and personalized mixing on the kind of on the output end. But some of these, the difficulty with these challenges is that we're trying to tap into, especially with the first challenge, we're trying to tap into maybe a specialized community of research that isn't quite there yet. There's really not a great deal, and I'm kind of happy to see it growing, but I think historically there's not a huge amount of research on music and hearing loss. But to run a challenge in a kind of meaningful and hopefully successful way, we need entrance. So I think part of this is a practical aspect, in that we know that music source separation is a really kind of active field of work, and we're thinking about, when we're designing these challenges, what other existing communities that we can tap into. And I think that's part of the decision-making process for thinking about this as a remix challenge. But as I said, with the kind of objective metrics and the subjective evaluation, there are imperfections there, and what we see is that some systems don't remix the stems. They demix and then choose to use the kind of original gains for those stems. And there's that tension there, because with Hacky, for example, being that intrusive metric, if these systems do remix, then it might, and some systems did, then it might well be that the listener panel scores are improved, but it's likely that the Hacky scores will be penalized in some way. So there are these kinds of intricacies, but yeah, we were hoping to kind of tap in, and I think we did, that kind of source separation community, and bring them into this kind of context of music and hearing loss.
Okay, thank you. Understood. Thanks.
You. Okay, we're past the hour now, so probably need to wrap up. But if anybody has any other questions, then please do feel free to get in touch with Scott and the project team. So our next seminar, thanks to those of you who have listened all the way through today. Our next seminar is on the 25th of March, and we'll be welcoming Chi Lo from Toronto Metropolitan University, who's going to be talking about rhythm perception and speech in noise outcomes in older adults with hearing loss. And then also Alan Sanderson from Brighton and Sussex Medical School, and he's going to be talking about lessons learned from running his Amplitude, which is his audiology clinic for musicians. So I will advertise those talks in the usual way over the coming weeks. The time of the session, I can see someone's just said, what time is that? So it's the usual time. So 2 p.m. GMT, 3 p.m. Central Eastern Time. So that's the next one. We'll send the details round. So I just want to say a final thanks to Scott and to Waldo. Thank you for your talks. It's been really informative. And we look forward to the next one. All right. Bye, everybody.